Okay. So how the network computers influence the development of the systems theories and the flaws of those. What I just took from it, I just noticed that his argument in the beginning was like ecologic. I'm sorry, I'm really bad with words. Is it ecologic?
Ecological.
Ecological. Yeah. Begins to look at the natural world as a mechanical system in which all life forms naturally find like their own equilibrium over time, basically, and that the models treated everything like a smooth like running machine, I guess, and a reasonable assumption in the world of like computers. He suggests such models are ineffective when applied to the natural world or to human society. What was that last part you said? They're ineffective when applied to the natural world or to human society.
Yeah, you can go, David, and I'm going to piggyback on that.
So this idea comes from Arthur Tansley. Since we're starting over, I'll just repeat this. Arthur Tansley was a biologist. He met with Freud, and one of Freud's main ideas was that the brain, or one of Freud's obscure ideas, is the brain is an electrical machine. And Arthur Tansley took this and took a couple leaps of logic and determined that nature was the same idea. It was the systems theory where, as she just talked about, everything is an energy feedback loop. So a grasshopper eats the grass, something eats the grasshopper, then it dies and it fertilizes new grass. So like the energy stayed within itself, within that ecosystem. Well, these were the feedback loops of the systems theory, and as she also said, it meant that nature would self-regulate itself to its equilibrium. They call it like the law of equilibrium. Jay Forrester also talked. Arthur Tansley brought up several ideas. Jay Forrester was the one who really came up with the feedback loops idea, where there'd be a problem, there'd be a reaction, then a new set of circumstances, and new problems, and new reactions. And they turned this into the idea that through computers, when you have enough information, you can create a new, like a computer-type system that would create an equilibrium for society. So we extrapolated this idea about nature and put it onto society as a whole, where they could, essentially you'd get rid of the old version or the now version of hierarchies of power, and it would be replaced by self-organizing networks. This works when you're talking purely about computers, but it was way oversimplified when having to do with nature. They went into a ridiculous series of tests in nature, trying, like in one single ecosystem, trying to map out these feedback loops and systems of energy distribution, basically. And no matter how much information they put into it, it got worse and worse, and they couldn't ever figure it out because it doesn't work in nature. Go on.
Oh yeah, just to like go off of that. So basically, like our modern network of like personal computers, he basically suggests is like a modern attempt to replicate the utopian ideals of a hippie commune on a larger scale. We're basically like all nodes like in a network now, like plugged into like a vast like global system in a sense.
Exactly.
So to go off of that, the way technology is definitely ineffective when it comes to certain aspects. As far as, like I was saying in the first question, the communication between certain groups is not there. And then how in her explanation it's ineffective. It just depends on the situation that the person is talking about. As far as communication, technology is a barrier, but it's also like a positive for it. And then as far as human communication, it takes away what we really feel, and sometimes it helps us explain it. But those are like the positives and negatives when talking about when talking about technology and communicating, because we can live without it, but then it helps us to get our point across better.
Right.
Opposed to people who understand what we're talking about, and then people who are lost in the situation.
Like, go ahead.
I thought the biggest thing for me was pretty much trying to compare pretty much the earth, the whole, you know, so many different cultures, so many different countries, as a machine, and trying to predict their behavior. And like you were saying before, it was extremely oversimplified, and it removed some of the dynamic variables from human beings. For example, you can talk about, like, for example, communication. Some of our symbols, they aren't the same. You know what I mean? So if one thing happens here, you may not think it's the same. And I understand that for equilibrium, for example, it may, how am I trying to put this? Actually, I don't know how to really completely put this out in words, but I just feel like there's so many different variables that it doesn't really take into place. For example, he was talking about politicians, and not all are obviously power hungry, but politicians are power hungry, and then there's so many different ways of life. For example, you have capitalism, and then you have communism. You know what I mean? There's so many different
religious
variables.
aspects.
Yeah, there's so many different variables that he didn't put into the systems theory, or at least put out on paper when he did his drawing, that I don't think it was a accurate representation of, you know, human communication in the world.
Like, it can't be equal. There's too many different groups, cultures, languages, ideas. That's like with human rights, for example.
Everybody has their own individual agenda that it would be hard to get everybody on the same page.
Exactly. There's no true definition for it because everybody thinks of it differently. So if I think it some way and then you think it a different way, then y'all two have completely different views.
Right.
There's no way for us to come to one main definition, and that's where the communication stops because we don't care, and then we have our own followers or we have people who understand us, and it's just like we're stuck in our own frame instead of trying to work together to become equal and understand where the next person is coming from.
Right.
I'm sorry. If you want to go ahead.
Okay. And he basically constantly points out the flaws in our political systems. So he basically notes that although social media has played an important part in the various revolutions that may have occurred in different places.
Arab Spring, I think, was the example he gave.
Right, exactly. And then it basically is our computer networks provide a way of otherwise disconnected people to coordinate themselves, as he says, but offers no idea of what's to come next type of thing.
So to piggyback off these ideas, so the example of where I think he was trying to get an idea, something that would back up his theory, would be the Pong experiment from the first video that we watched, where everybody had one of two colored paddles, and you raised yours with the green side, and your sides went up, and if you put the red side, your sides went down. And they found that people self-organized within their teams to not overshoot. So not everybody went up when the bar had to go up to stop the ball. But I think, again, this was an oversimplification, because I don't think everything in human nature is quantifiable. And in order to put it into a machine, there has to be a quantity attached to it. So we are still recording, right?
Yeah, go ahead.
So in order to put it into a computer for these feedback loops to work and to map it out, everything has to be quantifiable. So I know they've kind of quantified intelligence through IQ points, but one of the big things that they were finding in these the hippie communes during the 60s were people who just were naturally more bold or just kind of leaders. They still so these communities were trying to create these feedback loops of there's no hierarchy. There's no hierarchy. There's nothing along those lines. Everybody can individually speak for themselves, and kind of created a quote-unquote utopian society. But what they found was certain people just have more leadership qualities and ability than others, and so a meek and mild person isn't going to necessarily stand up to somebody who is a very strong, forceful personality, even if they really believe in something. And you can't quantify, at least we haven't yet been able to quantify leadership or boldness or just intestinal fortitude of, I'm going to stand up for my belief, and if I don't, well, then I'm getting pushed down, and then suddenly that is a hierarchy. like that was created by itself. So every one of the communes failed.
I think that also goes back to how I was saying, like, humans aren't machine-like. Well, like you were saying as well. For example, there's so many different ways you can interpret an action or something from a human. For example, if she says something to me, I could lie dead smack to her face for my own agenda, so it wouldn't really be measurable. I think that's another one of the problems why I think, at least, the internet wouldn't create a self-sustaining society. And then it would just be completely impossible, I think, at least because the internet or technology wouldn't access everybody. Even if it did, there would be a huge gap in between, so everybody wouldn't have access to the same people, same things, and same ideas.
I don't think it accounts for the individuality, or if you want to take it as far as selfishness of people. Where, I mean, like, no offense, but if I have a kid, I'm going to take care of that kid more than I'm going to take care of my neighbor.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
so like I know, like in the communes, you weren't supposed to do that, and the idea for this utopian society was there was no government that told you what to do. There was nobody doing that. But at the end of the day, I'm like, maybe I'm crazy, but I'm going to look out for my own first, which immediately undercuts everybody else's idea. You know, how can I believe that all of society is going to back me up and my kids up? You know, when throughout history that's never happened once. So, I mean, and then how do you quantify that? You know,
Right.
and put that into your computer to account for that so it's taken care of. As of right now, we can't do that. There's just too many variables.
Right.
I don't know. I'm in the middle. I'm at yes and no, because it does create a society of like prestigious people to where we all connect with each other, but at the same time there is that group of people who are left out. So I think the internet does sustain a self-organizing like society, but there should be ways that people who aren't a part of that society to be able to at least know what's going on, or to get some type of understanding of what we're doing, to see if it even is affecting them or not affecting them. Because that's another thing, they don't know the true meaning of what we're doing. And if they understood it, maybe then they would want to get involved with it, and that's probably the problem too. Like, there's so much going on. There's what is that called? Where you pick what you want. You taking what you want. Yeah. Where you skip over.
How you pretty much reassure your own ideas.
Okay.
Where you skip over information. You taking what you want. And
Yeah.
And you.
Selective hearing.
Selective,
Yeah.
you
You take in what,
selective.
you
Yeah,
hear the
take
points
in-
that agree with your point and
Yeah.
Exactly.
block out all the others. Yeah.
Right.
So it does, in a way, make a society, but at the same time, there's societies within that society.
Yeah.
So it's also good and bad.
I think it was also important, we didn't point this out, at least I can't remember if we did, but the ecologists, pretty much they thought they were dealing with a stable world. And that's why it was so easy to compare humanity to machines. But instead they found that there was always some sort of dynamic or unpredictable change. And they also pointed out in nature, pretty much when there was something, some drastic event that would change pretty much the environment, it wouldn't completely go back to how it was before. Instead, it would completely shift what was once there to something completely new.
I got an example of that, a forest fire. That's a completely natural event that
Right.
happens. It may wipe out a whole area. That doesn't mean that area is gone forever, but it's also, you're not going to have the same forest that you just had.
before.
So like if you had a 100-acre forest and 50 acres of it burned, you know, the right half, when it grows up in 50, 60, 100 years, it's going to look distinctly different than the left
Than the
half.
other. Right.
There are going to be two completely different ecosystems because completely new sets of circumstances have arisen.
But even then, at the same time, that burned half is going to affect the other half.
Absolutely, and then that
Right.
left half is going to change also, just because of different variables or the same variables that are going to affect it differently.
Right.
Or like the deep breathing, how it alters our mind. As far as like if we go without, for the detox, if we go without our phones, everything is changing. How we look, how we read, and how we act. That's a major change right there.
Yeah. 14 days is
It was definitely hard. It was rough.
Yeah,
Very true.
definitely.
Does anybody have any other points that we want with this one?